The day before my sister's wedding, she smiled. You should take some space. So I did. I sold the condo she thought was her gift and left an envelope at every table. What was inside? She'll never forget. She said it sweetly. That's the part one can't stop thinking about. Not with cruelty in her voice. Not with the sharp edge she used behind closed doors when she was tired of pretending. She said it the way you'd offer someone tea they music didn't ask for, like she was doing me a favor, like the kindest thing she could possibly do for herself on the eve of her wedding was to let me know I was the problem. Her name is Evelyn, my big sister. Small first so she would have more room. She stood in her guest room in a half-hind wedding gown, her hair twisted into a loose updo, the late September light catching the sequins on her bodice. Behind her, her fiancé Gavin hovered in the doorway in a way that reminded me of a man standing near a fire exit he'd already mapped. She looked at me in the mirror and smiled. This particular smile she has. Music. All surface, nothing underneath. And she said that the greatest gift I could give her wedding was to take some space from our family. I was kneeling on the floor, at the time straightening the hem of her dress. I stood up slowly, smoothed my jacket, and said nothing. 12 hours. Later, I called my attorney, and 3 days after that, I walked into her wedding reception and placed a white envelope on every single table. What was inside those envelopes? By the time you finish reading this, you'll understand why. She'll never forget it. But first, you need to understand what I'd already given her and what she'd been doing with it, what I built before I knew what it was. For our parents died when I was 17, February, one of those Wisconsin mornings that presses down on everything, like a gray ceiling that sunk too low, an icy overpass, a quarter second of wrong conditions. And then I was standing outside St. Luke's Hospital with a police officer explaining something I couldn't quite make register. In my brain, Evelyn showed up 3 minutes later with snow in her hair. She pulled me against her coat before anyone said a word. In that moment, she was 20 years old and the strongest person I had ever seen. Everyone said so. They praised her endlessly. The aunts, the neighbors, the school counselors. Evelyn is handling it beautifully. Evelyn is so mature. Evelyn is keeping the family together. She wore that praise like armor, and for a long time, I believed the armor was real. It took years to understand. Music that she was collecting the attention the same way some people collect debt. Gratefully at first, then unable to stop. I finished high school. I got a scholarship. I went to college, graduated, and built a career as an IT project coordinator at a firm in downtown Milwaukee. I worked hard in the deliberate, quiet way of people who were never allowed to be loud about their ambitions. I paid off my own debt. I kept my apartment clean. I woke up every morning and made choices that left nothing behind for someone else to fix. Meanwhile, Evelyn needed things, not in an obvious way. She never showed up at my door bankrupt or desperate. She was too proud for that. She needed things in the drip drip way of a leaking faucet. A loan here, a small deposit there, an advance she'd pay back after a few things cleared, a favor that somehow never ended. When I was 29, I found the key. It was in a shoebox under my childhood bed, which I'd been slowly clearing when our last remaining aunt finally sold the family home. A key ring with 2 silver keys and a small laminated tag that said Racine in my mother's handwriting. She had kept a small condo there, modest, dated, with carpet that needed to go and a kitchen. Backsplash music that belonged to a different decade, and somehow no one had done anything with it in the years since she died. It, not to sell, not to flip. I took it because it still smelled like her, faintly, in the way old spaces hold on to people, and I wasn't ready to let that go yet. Over the next 2 years, I renovated it on weekends. I ripped up the carpet myself and found decent hardwood underneath. I refinished it over 3 long Saturdays, knees aching, arms burning. I repainted every room in colors my mother would have loved. I installed a tile backsplash in the kitchen by hand, cutting each piece on a rented wet saw, praying I wouldn't ruin the pattern. I did it because I wanted there to be something left of her, something warm and real that both Evelyn and I could walk into and feel held. When I brought Evelyn there the first time, she stood in the doorway with her hand over her mouth. She turned and hugged me so hard I felt my spine crack. She said, "No one has ever loved me the way you do." I gave her the keys. I told her it was hers. She told me it would be a place where we could both heal. She meant it, I think, for about 11 months. Then Gavin music arrived. The new Arrangement Gavin Rhodes was the kind of man who was never not performing. 35. Athletic, groomed in that deliberate way. That looks effortless only if you've never worked to maintain it. He had a laugh that arrived half a second too. Quickly, a habit of finishing other people's sentences, and eyes that cataloged everything in a room before he said hello. Evelyn fell hard. I had seen her fall before. She always fell like someone jumping from a great height, fully committed, looking down at the landing only after the leap. I wanted to be happy for her. I tried. The small things started almost immediately. He began joining us on calls, his voice sliding into conversations that had always been just the two of us. Evelyn stopped mentioning her therapy appointments without explaining why. She canceled plans with me to avoid certain restaurants. Gavin doesn't love that area, and then stopped explaining even that much. She started asking me not to mention my promotions at work in front of him because he was in a sensitive place about his career path. I swallowed all of it. I told myself this was what people did for love, made small adjustments, gave new relationships room to breathe. I told myself Evelyn finally seemed settled, and then she started asking about money. Never dramatic amounts, always reasonable sounding requests, always temporarily, always with a very plausible explanation. A deposit that needed covering before the vendor closed, a gap between checks. A shared account that was briefly locked, pending a transfer. I gave her what she asked for twice, music 3 times, then a 4th, mentioned the rising cost of weddings during one of her calls. Her voice went flat and she changed the subject so fast it made my ears ring. I told myself it was wedding stress. Music I had gotten very good at. Telling myself things. The dressing room. I drove to her house straight from work on music a late September afternoon, still in my blazer, laptop, bag in the back seat, telling myself this visit would be simple. One last sister moment before everything shifted. That word simple. I should have known better. She was in her guest room in the wedding gown's bodice, hair pinned up, looking into a long mirror the way brides do, measuring themselves against some imagined version of who they're about to become. I walked over without thinking and knelt down to straighten the hem where it wrinkled near the floor. 16 years of habit, 16 years of adjusting things for her. In the mirror, she looked down at me with that particular smile, and she said it, that the greatest gift for her wedding would be me taking some space from our family. She said it brightly, almost playfully, like she was complimenting my ability to understand what she needed. She said I had a way of clouding her energy, that I brought old complications to things that were supposed to be joyful. She said it was her time to build a life that was hers alone, not tied to old grief or obligations. Obligations. I was still kneeling on the floor when she said that word. I thought about the condo, about 2 years of weekends on my knees on different floors for different reasons, about the music keys I pressed into her hands and what she said when I gave them to her. Behind her, Gavin stepped into the doorway. He leaned one shoulder against the frame in the casual way of men who have already decided they own any room they're standing in. He told me not to take it personally, that big life events bring up old tensions, that I had a tendency to misread situations. He said this in the gentle, patient tone people use when they want you to feel corrected without the discomfort of an actual confrontation. I stood music up. Slowly, I smoothed my jacket. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and I said quietly that I didn't understand. Music, she laughed, not with warmth, with a small private amusement, like my question was slightly ridiculous. Then, she said that if I truly loved her, I would give her the one gift she was asking music for and step away. I walked out without slamming the door. I chose silence instead of apology for the first time in my life. As I moved down her hallway, I heard Gavin's low voice say he knew this would happen, that I always made things about myself. Outside, into the cooling evening air, I stood next to my car. The sun was dropping behind the rooftops, turning everything amber and quiet. My chest felt hollow, but my hands were steady. That surprised me. I didn't drive home right away. I just stood there and let the weight of it settle into my bones where it stopped feeling like hurt and started feeling like information. The email I wasn't supposed to remember. I got home at 8:47 p.m., still in my work clothes. I sat at the dining table with my laptop already open and noticed a blinking notification at the top of my email inbox. It was from my attorney, a routine annual property summary. I almost deleted it without opening. Almost. I clicked. Music it. Stared at it for a full minute. The condo was listed under my name. Sole owner. Not transferred. Not joint. Not pending any legal transaction. Exactly as it had been. Since my mother's estate was settled, I had never formally transferred title. I had handed Evelyn a key and told her it was hers, but I had never filed the paperwork that would have made that legal. A lawyer could spend weeks debating whether my intentions counted as a gift. The document on my screen was much simpler. Under Wisconsin property law, the condo was still mine. I whispered something into the empty room. I don't remember exactly what. Something about taking it back in a way they would never expect. Then I picked up my phone and called someone I hadn't spoken to in 2 years. Ethan Walden. Ethan Walden is a private investigator based in Milwaukee. 51 years old. Former county fraud examiner. The kind of rumpled but precise man you'd overlook in a room full of louder people, which is exactly why he's effective. I had worked with him during a messy internal embezzlement case at my company, and he had a way of pulling apart complicated situations with the calm patience of someone who is never surprised by what people will do for money. He answered on the third ring. I told him everything in 20 minutes, starting with Gavin and ending with the property summary on my screen. He listened without interrupting, his chair creaking faintly in the background. I remembered that sound from conference calls, the sound of him shifting into full attention. He said he could pull a preliminary background check overnight. We agreed to meet the next morning at a coffee shop near downtown. I barely slept. The folder. Ethan was already seated when I walked in the next morning, a manila folder on the table beside his coffee cup. He stood briefly, then sat and waited for me to order. He didn't open the folder right away. He waited until I had both hands wrapped around a mug I didn't actually want, and then he placed it between us and started talking. What he had found made the room go slightly cold. Gavin Rhodes was not Gavin's only name. Over the preceding decade, he had used 2 different last names across 4 states, attached to a trail of addresses, civil court filings, and at least 2 formal complaints. Ethan had printed the relevant pages. Ohio records, music, Michigan records, a series of LLC registrations that existed for 12 to 18 months before dissolving without trace. In Ohio, a woman named Linda Farrow, then 53, had filed against a man matching Gavin's description for borrowing a large sum under the premise of investing it in a startup. He had disappeared before any action was taken. The case was dropped when he couldn't be located, and Linda couldn't sustain the legal costs alone. In Michigan, a man named Daniel Rhodes, no relation, music, different last name, same face in a grainy property record photo, had reported Gavin for defrauding him in a supposed joint venture. Borrowed savings, promised returns gone. Ethan pushed a third section toward music, me. This one had my name in it and Evelyn's. He had run a lien search on the condo. No official liens were recorded in my name, but there was something else. A draft credit application at a local bank, incomplete. Music, and never finalized, in which Gavin had begun the paperwork to use the condo as collateral for renovation loan. The signature block listed me as property owner. The co-signer block listed Evelyn. He had been trying to put my sister's name on debt secured by property that wasn't even hers. My throat tightened. I told Ethan I had never authorized any loan, never agreed to any of it. He said he believed me. Then he said the thing that replaced every remaining doubt with something harder. He said, if your sister marries this man and signs anything he puts in front of her, she will be responsible for whatever he's done and whatever he plans to do next. These people don't stop. They just move on to the next level. He placed a small silver USB drive on the table between us. He said, everything was on it: complaints, public filings, bankruptcy mentions, the draft, loan paperwork, and records on a woman named Kathy from Michigan who matched someone the bridesmaids had whispered about at the rehearsal dinner I'd attended the night before. I picked up the USB. It was lighter than it should have been for what it contained. The decision in a Quick Trip parking lot. I sat in my car for 19 minutes after leaving the cafe, not crying, not shaking, just sitting with the folder on the passenger seat and the USB in my palm, doing the math I had been refusing to do for months. Gavin had already tried to leverage the condo once. Music, the wedding was the next morning. Once those papers were signed and the accounts were merged, everything Evelyn had, including whatever residual claims she believed she had to the condo, became part of a financial trap this man had been constructing for years. The Music was not whether to act. The question was how. I called my attorney from the parking lot. His name is Robert Fisk, a property and family law attorney I had used twice before. Efficient enough that he'd once told me his billable hour was cheaper than the mistakes his clients made when they didn't call him. I told him I wanted to list the condo for an immediate sale. He asked if I was certain, more certain than anything I told him. He called back in 40 minutes with a cash offer from a development buyer he'd worked with before. The price was more than fair. I authorized everything electronically in my car, fingers steady on the screen. The condo was no longer mine by the time I drove to Minnesota for the wedding, and it would never, under any legal configuration, belong to Gavin Rhodes. The white envelopes, I will tell you now what was inside them, because that's the question you've been holding since the title. Ethan had spent the previous night compiling the documents from the USB into plain language summaries, not legal briefs, not jargon-heavy reports, but clear, readable pages that any reasonable adult could understand in a single sitting. A concise history of Gavin's financial predation, the Ohio complaint, the Michigan complaint, named victims, named shell companies, named music dates, and at the end, a single page describing the draft loan paperwork he had attempted using the condo, the property, that as of 2 days ago had been sold. He printed 112 copies. They went into white envelopes, one per place setting. At the wedding reception, we had arranged it with the banquet coordinator. 3 days earlier, Ethan told her they were favor envelopes from the couple. She didn't look closely. I arrived at the Minnesota resort on the morning of the wedding, processed everything in that methodical way you move through tasks. When you've made a decision and there's nothing left to second guess. I sat through the ceremony by the lake. I watched Evelyn say, I do, with tears on her face and trembling hands and a look in her eyes that broke a piece of me. Not because I thought I was wrong, but because I knew she believed completely and genuinely that this was the beginning of something safe. I sat through it. I saved the storm for the reception, the ballroom. The room was everything Evelyn had wanted. Ivory, tablecloths, eucalyptus runners, candles, in clear glass holders, windows looking out over a lake that turned gold in the afternoon light. It was beautiful in that precise, considered way that takes months to plan and 3 hours to consume. Guests filed in laughing and flushed from the ceremony. The band played something soft and orchestral. Champagne moved through the room in long-stemmed flutes. Music on every table. The white envelopes sat perfectly placed, small and unassuming. Ethan stood near the back in a dark suit, indistinguishable from the event staff. 2 plainclothes detectives, Detective Kara Simmons and her partner, Detective Rain Wynn, both of the Milwaukee Financial Crimes Unit, who had reviewed Ethan's documentation the previous week and had been in contact with their counterparts in Ohio and Michigan, sat near the bar with the relaxed posture of guests who had nowhere to be. Their jackets were slightly heavier than the occasion required. Linda Farrow sat at table 7 in a dark dress, her auburn hair pulled back. She had driven in from Ohio. She was 58 years old and had not stopped being angry in 4 years. Daniel Rhodes sat at table 12. He had flown from Michigan that morning. He looked like a man who had been waiting a very long time to be in the same room as his particular piece of unfinished business. The newly married couple entered last. Gavin had his hand at the small of Evelyn's back in that proprietary way that looks like affection until you know what it is. When his eyes found mine, across the room, the corners of his mouth lifted. He believed he had won. He had married into a family. He had a claim on a woman who trusted him. He had plans. He had not checked the tables. Dinner service began. People talked over their salads. The band shifted registers. A flower girl at table 4 fell asleep against her grandfather. Everything looked exactly like a wedding. Reception looks when it's working the way it's supposed to. Then at table 7, a chair scraped back. The moment Linda Farrow stood up, she was holding an open envelope. The printed page trembled in her hand. She did not shout. Immediately, she made a sound that was almost a gasp, almost a cry that cut cleanly through the noise and turned every head in the room. Then she said that the man at the head table had stolen money from her in Ohio, that he had called it an investment, that he had smiled and called her regularly and borrowed her savings, music, and then disappeared before she could get a single cent back. She said she had told her children their college money was gone because of a man with a different last name and the same eyes. Her voice broke on the word stolen, but she didn't sit down. Gavin laughed. He actually laughed, a short, incredulous sound like a man who has been through this before and knows exactly how to handle it. He started to say something about a misunderstanding, about bitter people, about a clear up, but the room had already turned a corner it couldn't walk back from. Guests were opening the envelopes. That sound, paper tearing, one table after another, was the quietest devastation I have ever heard. It spread through the room in a wave. Then the faces changed. Music, surprise. First, then confusion, then the specific expression people get when they read. Something that rearranges what they thought they understood. At table 12, Daniel stood. He held his pages up the way a man holds evidence, not for drama, but because he wants to be sure everyone can see. He said he had filed a complaint in Michigan and been ignored. He said Gavin had taken his savings under a fake business plan and moved to a new state before the legal process could catch up. He said he had been paying off that debt alone for years, while Gavin kept smiling in photographs. On social media with a new woman, Gavin was on his feet. He was music talking, fast, his voice rising, the charm entirely gone now, peeled away in public, like paint in the rain. He called it attack. He called it jealousy. His eyes swept the room for an exit. They found me instead. He pointed across the reception hall and said this was my doing, said I was crazy. Music said I had always been jealous of my sisters. Happiness said I set the whole thing up because I couldn't stand to see her move on with her life. Every head turned toward me. I didn't flinch. I had been afraid of that moment for years. The moment when a room full of people turned to look at me with Evelyn's judgment in their eyes. I had spent my whole adult life contorting myself to avoid it. It felt like absolutely nothing. Detective Simmons stood up from near the bar. She identified herself, stated her unit, and said in a calm, professional tone that multiple formal complaints had been received and that the documentation distributed at the tables had been shared with their department and the financial crimes units in Ohio and Michigan. She said they were there to take formal statements and that Gavin Rhodes was currently subject to detainment pending that process. Gavin bolted. He made it 3 strides toward the side exit before Detective Nguyen cut him off near the edge of the dance floor. He grabbed Gavin's arm. Gavin yanked and swore and stumbled, and then the detective's grip held, and the whole room watched a man in a fitted wedding suit and cufflinks get walked back toward the entrance like something inevitable that had been postponed for too long. Evelyn was on her feet. Her chair had toppled. She was calling Gavin's name, demanding he say something, tell her something, give her anything that could hold the shape of the day she had planned. He turned once, still struggling, and shouted that none of it was real, that these were people blaming him for their own failures. His eyes met mine a final time across the ruined reception. He didn't say anything else worth remembering. The floor and what came after Evelyn's knees buckled when the detective finally got Gavin out the door. Her bouquet hit the floor. Petals scattered across the polished wood. White peonies she'd chosen, specifically because she read somewhere they meant new beginnings, a bridesmaid, and the coordinator caught her before she went all the way down. The room was moving and loud and hot, and underneath all of it, my feet stayed planted. Old habit told me to run to her. 16 years of reflex sent across the room. Hold her together, absorb everything she felt until she was steady again. I stood still. Music, I had loved her by doing everything for her. It hadn't saved either of us. This time I let the truth do the work I couldn't. What the envelopes actually took. I drove home to Wisconsin the next morning. Condo sale closed, funds transferred. The story leaked the way these things do. Grainy phone footage, resort staff who talked to a friend who talked to a journalist. And within 4 days, it was in the local news. No names deliberately, but everyone who needed to know knew. Gavin was formally charged 3 weeks later. The Ohio and Michigan cases, previously stalled by geography and limited resources, were reopened under a coordinated multi-state filing. Linda Farrow called me once simply to say, thank you, her voice thick with something that wasn't quite relief, but was close to it. Daniel texted a single line, he won't do this to anyone else. For Evelyn, the fraudulent credit lines Gavin had rushed her to sign were placed under dispute. The bank's internal review, triggered partly by Ethan's documentation of the draft loan attempt on the condo, flagged several accounts for misrepresentation, with help from a legal aid group and a financial counselor named Adrian Polk, who had 15 years in consumer debt advocacy. Evelyn was able to get the most damaging obligations suspended and eventually voided. She wasn't unscathed, but she wasn't crushed either. The thing he had most counted on, the condo as Collateral, the property that tied me to. Their financial mess was gone. Music, sold, legitimate, out of reach. He had planned to use the last warm piece of our mother against us. I didn't let him. A Saturday morning in October, 6 months. Later, a kitchen table in Madison, a cup of cinnamon coffee going lukewarm, a journal open to a blank page. I had moved. A townhouse on a quiet street with maple trees that were doing something extraordinary in the October. Light dropping gold all over the sidewalk. Music, I had found a therapist named Dr. Patricia Rourke, who specialized in family systems and trauma and had a small frame sign in her office that said, "Clarity is not cruelty." I had joined a Saturday hiking group and acquired friends who had no idea what my family history was and did not need to. I had slowly, carefully started seeing someone. Nothing music. Rushed, nothing loud, just something real. Evelyn and I spoke every few days. Now, not the way we used to, where I functioned as her emotional infrastructure differently with boundaries that held like the frame of a well-built house. She had told me once, sitting at my kitchen table a month after the wedding collapsed, that when everything fell apart, the first person she wanted to call was me, the same person she had told to disappear from her life. I told her I knew. She asked, how? I said, because I was still there. That morning in October with the journal open and the leaves falling, I thought about the dressing room, about kneeling on the floor at her feet while she smiled in the mirror, about what it felt like to be told your presence was the problem. And then I thought about the envelopes, about the sound of paper tearing across a beautiful light-covered room, about a man being walked out through his own wedding by a detective who had reviewed the evidence and found it more than sufficient. I didn't need to hold on to the anger anymore. It had already done its job. I wrote one line in the journal that morning, the only thing that felt completely true. She asked me to disappear from the family. So I disappeared from being the person who kept the family from seeing the truth. I closed the journal. Sunlight moved across the floor. A couple of kids on bikes blew past the window laughing at something I couldn't hear through the glass. It was the most ordinary, quietly extraordinary morning I had ever had. I hadn't disappeared from my family. I had disappeared from being their excuse. Music, and that was the only gift I ever needed to give myself.